One of the things that might catch ASP.NET developers off guard is the lack of state when working with user input, something that server controls simply did for you without much thought on your part at all. It can make some developers wonder if they need to dust off their HTML skills a bit, taking a few steps back to 1999, where request.form was king. The good news is that ASP.NET MVC can leverage naming and some convention to not only approximate the ASP.NET server control interactions, can actually improve on it. In this episode, I'll show you how the HTML helpers, using convention, can remove a lot of the drudge work associated with user input. And in addition, I'll show you some of the new stuff coming with ASP.NET MVC 2. Well, my little blog demo app is coming along. Of course, it looks pretty, and we've decruftified the homepage. Now what I want to do is to create an input form so I can actually create some posts without having to go straight into the database. So to do that, what I'm going to do today is a number of things. Number one, I'm going to show you how to work just straight with HTML. If you want to do it all by hand, you sure can. Then I'm going to show you how to make your life a little bit easier working with the framework by using HTML helpers and the model binders. Finally, I'm going to show you some of the new stuff that's come along in ASP.NET MVC 2, including some of the templates that you can use. Now, something to note, there is some built-in validation that I will touch on, showing you how to work with it server-side. I am not going to dive into hooking up jQuery validation and the AJAX helper validation. The reason for that is we're going to have a whole episode or 4 on working with your model and model binding and how that whole process works. So I really want to capture that end-to-end, so I'm going to toss that off until later. But I am going to show you how to output the results onto the page, so that'll be helpful. Okay, well, let's get to it. Let's take a look at how to work with HTML and the ASP.NET MVC framework. Okay, well, I'm going to start out by saying you don't have to use the framework to write the HTML. It's only there as an option, but should you choose to use it, it makes life a lot easier. So to show you what I mean, here's my blog, right? And on the homepage here, I have lots of posts, but I have no way of adding a post. So let's do that. I'm going to head back over here into my application. I'm going to open up my home controller. First thing I need to do is to add a action that is going to respond to create. This is going to be the URL that I call, the action that I call when I want to use a create form for adding new data. And here I'm not going to do anything tricky. I'm just going to return a view. All right, well, as astute watchers probably know already, hey, where's my view, man? I don't have a view yet. I can't really have this if I don't have an HTML. That is the whole point of the demo. So what I want to show you is thing one that you can do that'll speed you right along. And that is just to right click here and hit add view. Inside here, it's going to ask us what's your view name. It already knows the name because we're inside, when we right clicked, we're inside this create method. Next up, it already knows we're working with a blog.data.post because we did that previously. Finally, for the content, oh, by the way, if you want to choose a different model, you sure can. Just do this drop down right here, and it reflects over all the classes in your application. So for the view content, I can leave the thing empty if I want, or I can have the tooling create the page for me. There's a lot of choices I have in here. I have one for create, which is going to make a create form, one for edit, one for list. You've seen these before, I'm sure, in one of Hanselman's demos. So I'll hit add, and what that actually does is it comes down here, drops in the create view for me. Look at that. All of the HTML that I require is done. This is called scaffolding. And a lot of people think that scaffolding is just essentially forms over data, where you get a nice CRUD, which is create, read, update, and delete scenario, and you're done. And dynamic scaffolding is super awesome, but that is not what scaffolding is. Scaffolding is much like what you would expect the analogy to be. When you have a building and you put scaffolding around it, it helps you raise the building. That is the idea behind this. This is just simply a template for what you might want on this page. You are supposed to come in here and edit this, and off you go. This is not the end product. Okay, if I was going to do this, this demo would be over, and I could just wave my arms and say, isn't it just great? These helpers just write HTML for you and yada yada. But that's not why you're watching this series on TechPub, right? You want to know how to do this yourself. Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to delete this. I am not against the tooling. The tooling is actually quite competent in this regard. Instead, what I'm going to do is I am just going to come in here, right-click, add view, and this time I'm going to name this thing myself. because I think it's beneficial to understand exactly what's going on. I'll still have the tooling create a typed view for me, and then this is going to be empty content. Okay, great. So now I have my create page, and now what I need to do is to write some HTML so I can input a blog post. So the interesting thing here is you don't need to do anything tricky. There's no controls. There's nothing special that MVC needs to see. It works with straight HTML. All it wants you to do is to post a form. So let's write that HTML. Here's my input form, and it is all basic HTML. And I named this, I named this to make ASP.NET Web Forms folks a little bit more comfortable, because coming from Web Forms, this is basically how you're supposed to name things, or at least it was when I was doing them a while back. And I actually have a purpose for naming these inputs this way. I want to actually show something in particular. Okay, so this is my form, and one thing that I've added since probably the last demos is I've added in my database here a categories table foreign keyed off to posts. So now we have to add in a category ID. Okay, so if I run this page and I want to take a look at my view, let me open this, and I can now go to, pull this window down a little bit, home, and here is my page. Title, published, body. Good. All right, well, let's default that publish date to something, shall we? So now what I can do, and here's just to show you, I can add in whatever code I want to, and I can say date time.now.to short date string. Okay, all right. So let's go back and make sure that the value is holding. Great. Okay, awesome. That's the date today. So what happens when I submit it? Nothing. Nothing at all. And notice everything disappears out of here. Not exactly an optimal experience, and people that are familiar with web forms that are watching this video probably saying, dude, it's got to be so much work to get this to work. Where's the post back? Well, it's not here. And so what I want to do now is I want to actually support that. Let's make it so that our post works. Okay, so to do that, what I need to do is come back in here to the home controller. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to create an overload of the create action. Now you might be looking at this going, huh? Well, typically in web forms, if you're familiar with that and not familiar with ASP.NET MVC, with web forms, the postback is handled by the exact same page that was served. So typically you might have onload event happen, and then you might look and say, hey, is page.postback? Well, if it is, or page.isPostback, if it is, then you hand it off to some other method. Or maybe you wire up an event for a particular button. With ASP.NET MVC, it actually sits right on top of HTTP and looks at the verbs that come in. So this is something that a lot of developers have to get used to, which is actually a good thing. The web works on top of a protocol called HTTP, and it works with this concept of nouns and verbs. I won't get too deep into this, but the verbs that you're concerned with are get and post, and MVC actually knows the difference. Get is just a regular request. Someone comes in, wants to see the form, which is what we just did here. It issues a get. Get goes and grabs the source. When we post this form, a post is used. The server knows the difference. We can actually signify the difference right here on top of our action. And we can say right here, http://verbs.get. This is how we're going to tell it. This action only responds to get, will not respond to post. This one, on the other hand, will respond to, if I type this correctly, http://verbs.post. Great. Okay. Well, now our server is able to hand off the difference. The routing module and the controller factory, all these things, the controller.execute knows the difference. It can tell which method to fire. However, if we now try and compile this, we get a problem because C# and the .NET framework say, that's not going to work. So that's okay, because this actually leads us down a good path. Now, typically inside of here, what we would do in the good old days is say, well, my value equals request.form. Don't want to do that. Don't need to do that. We can actually lean on the framework to do this for us. So what MVC will actually pass in for us is a thing called a form collection, and we can say form. This is simply a wrapper for a name-value pair. So now inside of here, we've done two things. We're able to say form dot, and all you can see, form dot all keys. You can see count, everything. This is request dot form, so we can use this. So let's go in here and write some code to handle this interaction for the postback. All right, here we go. Our code is written up, and there's plenty wrong with this. I'm going to say it right now. There is plenty wrong with this, but I'm going to be wiping all of this out in just a second. Typically, we do not want to just simply return the view. This might be a typical scenario with ASP.NET Web Forms, where you just want to show the same page. And you can also redirect off of do a response.redirect out of a web form to another page if you like. With MVC, this is precisely what we want to do for two reasons. One, we just, of course, want to show the new data that's been added. But two, if we respond with the same page, there's a chance that you could just hit refresh and resubmit the exact same data. So here we're going to just return a redirect. Okay, this should work. All right, well, notice what I've done here. I have done what's called left-right coding. I've instantiated my object. I have done a little left-right, setting the values right here, parsing dates, parsing integers, yucko, and everything should be good for this. So let's go check our names and make sure that we have everything right. Text body, okay, so we come back in here, and we have category ID. Let's call this, we'll just leave it that. Fine. Text body, DT published on, text title. Okay. So we're good to go. So let's do this. Let's now run this thing, and we'll come back over here to home.create. I'll refresh this. Okay, we're on a new page here, so let's just say this is my new post. Great. And leave the date the same. Let me say hello there. Great. And we'll leave the category as general. Go! Woohoo! I just want to show this is going to work. It's not a good idea for a number of reasons. All right. Hey, it worked. That's cool. Okay, well, this kind of thing is just not a good idea. And for obvious reasons, we don't have to want to be doing all this manual left-right stuff. Now, with web forms, this was not a big deal. It's kind of what you did. You created your object, and you basically said, hey, framework, what's the value of this text box? And with MVC, we don't need to do that. We can actually lean on the framework to do that. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. First thing we want to do is we want to change the names of all these things. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm actually going to change this to be the exact name of the properties on the model. So I'm going to change this to published on. I'll change this to body, and I'm going to come down here and leave that as category ID. So now in the home controller, I can actually get rid of all this. I can even get rid of that. And what we can do is we can rely on a thing called model binding that the framework does for us. In fact, if we tell the framework we're expecting a post to come in, it's going to do its best to satisfy us. So it'll create this object for us. It'll actually try and bind it to the form, and then we can use it right in here, which is pretty darn cool. Now, there are some issues with this that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes, so bear with me. Okay, so let's go back over here to home create once again, and let's refresh this to make sure all the naming took. There we go. All right, so now what I'm going to do is view source, come down here and show you, yes, goody, all the names took. This could be an issue if you're doing this at home. Okay, my next post, and we'll leave it here. Hello. Again. And this time we'll set the category to subsonic. Why not? I'll hit go. Look at that. I think it worked again. We lost a bunch of code. There it is. Hello again. We lost a bunch of code, which is great. And by flexing convention, we're able to not really worry about this so much. So that's all good. But what happens when there's an issue? What happens when is there a problem? Like, for instance, if back here on our home and create, where are we? There we go. Let's go down here. And we'll refresh this one more time. What if we don't put a valid date in here? What's going to happen in the database? Well, let's find out. I'm going to say invalid value. And in here, I'm going to put gobbledygook and hello stuff. And then we're going to hit go. Well, wow, look at that. Nothing went wrong, which is kind of bizarre. Hello stuff, invalid values, it's in. Yikes. So let's come back in here and show table data. And what I'm going to do is scroll all the way down to the bottom. Well, what happened to our date? Well, it defaulted to to nothing. That's not what we want. Basically, the short end of it is that, tried to assign a date on there, and it was null. Date can't be null, so framework tried to do its best for us, and it ended up getting assigned to datetime.min. So, hey, you know what? Model binders aren't perfect, but if it didn't throw, what the heck are we going to do? Well, the simple answer is we can just come in here and we can ask the model binders, hey, is model state valid? Model state is valid. And then if it's valid, we can come on in here and do our save operations. Else, we need to let the user know something. All right, well, let's come back up here. In fact, we'll throw our return statement in there. If it's not valid, what are we going to do? Well, we should just basically show the exact same view and say there's problems. So we can come up here and say return view, and we can do something really cool, which is to pass the post right back into the view. Because remember, it's a typed view. This is a chunk of data. It was bound. It's just like anything else. We can pass it down to the view and display it. Awesome. Okay, so now this should be workable for us. Okay, so let's go back here, build it, and I'll go back over here to my page. I'm going to hit back a couple times, and I'm going to refresh. And then let's say another invalid, blah, blah, and then hello, goodbye. Okay, so now when we hit go, nothing happened. It never came down and never hit the redirect right here. Basically, the model state was not valid, so it just returned the post. But now we have a bigger issue. How do we know what's going on here? We don't know anything. Well, this is where the HTML helpers come in. Instead of spinning these things up by hand, we should be using the helpers. So what we can do is a number of things. First, we can get rid of this form tag. Now, it's not a big deal, right? In fact, if you don't want to have the form written for you, you certainly don't have to. The thing you don't want to do, of course, is have the action hard-coded in there, because if you ever change your routes around, this will break. So you can do one of two things. You can use the URL helper, and you can say url.action, and this will go and look up in routing the proper output URL for the create action. So you don't need to worry about that. That's thing one. Thing two is you can just make your life a lot easier by saying using html.beginForm. There we go. Now, a lot of people don't like this. Now, a lot of people look at this and say, man, that is an abuse of the whole iDisposable thing. Why would you want to use a using statement in here? And I have a funny story about this. I wrote the prototype of all of the HTML helpers. This is like a big time prototype years ago, before Preview 1 was even tossed out. And I was working on a Saturday afternoon, and my phone rang, and it was Phil. And we were talking on phone for a bit, and then we started sharing screens. He's like, I got a great idea. Check out this code. And he showed me a cool way to pop out with a form helper. Because one of the big things that people were forgetting, because they didn't understand that you could have more than one form per page. In fact, they'd never even really dealt with it in terms of if web forms was their first framework, they never dealt with a form tag before. So they weren't sure on how to have a form tag show up on a page. So that's one of the things we need to address. So by using a disposable here, this would conveniently wrap this code in a form tag, and I thought it was really cool. So he and I kind of mused back and forth on stuff, and of course got hammered for abusiveness. Okay, well, whatever. Anyway, so this is HTML.beginForm. By default, it will go and post right back to the exact same method that it's on by convention. Or if you don't want it to, you can come in here in an overload and you can tell it which action to go to. The next thing we need to do is get rid of these guys. So we can simply come in here and say HTML text box. There's a ton of these guys. I'll show you more of them in just a second. We can say title. And we can do the same thing in here. In fact, if you wanted to, you could use jQuery. That would be the easiest thing. HTML.textbox. Notice all of the helpers that are in here. We have text area 4. I'm going to talk about that. That's some new stuff in MVC 2. Passwords. We have radio buttons. And if you come up here, we have check boxes, select lists, just about everything you'd need. Now, a lot of people, I'm not going to dive too deeply into this, but a lot of people actually prefer to write their HTML by hand, myself included. However, if you use the helpers, you get some sugary sweetness in here, which I'm just about to show you. So let's just continue on here. We can say published on, and remember, you want to keep this naming consistent in here because this is how the framework understands what you're talking about. And we can say, HTML.text area. Sorry, HTML.text area. And again, body. Now, if you want to send in some overloads, you certainly can for every single one of them. In fact, I'll tell you right now that this is one of the pain points of the HTML helpers is these overloads are actually not exactly straightforward. People don't understand how do we send an object in for HTML attributes. Well, let's say we want to set the style tag here. We could just say new using object initializers, open up some braces, and we could say style equals. And then, well, let's say we could put in, width and then we'll type in 80% and a semicolon, and then let's set the height to 80 pixels. Why not? Okay, what in the world is this? This looks a little bit wonky, but all this is going to do is it's going to take this, turn it into an attribute, and turn this into the attribute value. Okay, so that's how you do that. There's other ones that you can use as well. And if we open up this, of course, you can see that you can set the default value. So for published, we might exactly want to do that. We can say datetime.now.to short date string. All right. There's other things, of course, that we can do in here. So I'm going to pop this thing open. We've got value. Again, we got HTML attributes if you want to set the size. And if you are not comfortable with setting the attributes using the object initializer like we did, you can initialize a new dictionary. If you get to doing things like that, sometimes it's just flat better to write the HTML by hand. But I won't go there for now. This is just my opinion. Okay, well, let's just take what we have right now. And what I'm going to do is I am going to refresh this. It's going to try and resubmit the post. And now we get values passed back in. This is all just a benefit of using the HTML helpers. That's it. So now we actually have that kind of persistence scheme going on, but it's not really using view state. It's just using good old HTML. So that's kind of cool. All right. Okay, well, the next thing I need to do is to tackle this select list, otherwise known as a drop-down list to folks coming in from web forms. And this one is actually a little bit more tricky, I hate to say. The convention is actually extremely straightforward, but it is all too easy to get tripped up and overthink this thing. So what I want to do is I want to use the helpers. So let's start there. And I want to come in here and just say HTML.dropdown list for category ID. Okay, well, how in the world is this going to work? Where's our data? Because this needs, of course, the data from the table that I created, which, by the way, is over here. I should show you that real fast. And if I come over here and open up categories and show table data, we can see that all of the data is right there. Okay. How is it going to know about this stuff? Well, we need to somehow tell it. Now, you might be tempted if you click here and you can say, what are all these overloads? Maybe I need to pass this data in. Aha, here is this select list that I need to pass in. Now, if you wanted to, you could new up a data context and you could write some code in line here, and sure, you could do that, but you're going to end up hurting yourself, trust me. There's some other overloads in here, but I'm going to leave them all alone. They basically work the exact same way as these guys up here, using default values and settings, much like this guy. Instead, I'm just going to use the convention. This is the convention. Name it the same as your property on your object. Back here in the controller, to work with this thing, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new data context. We'll just say var_db equals new db. And then what we're going to do is we're going to lob some stuff into the view data. And in this case, I want to name it the exact same thing. All right. And what I could do is I could just create a brand new select list and then pass in an IEnumerable coming from the database. But I've done something a little bit more tricky. I've got my own extensions that does that for me. So in this case, I can say db.categories. And then since that's an IEnumerable, I can send this to a select list. And to do that, I simply come in here and then I can tell it I want the, let's go one more. I want the data value field to be category ID, and then the data text field to be description. That's it. Done. So now that the view data is a select list with the same name, I can then rerun and let's see, compile my site here and come back over here, make sure that everything is set. It is. So I can now just rerun my page here and we'll go over here to home, create, and I can refresh and done. So it works. Woohoo! Yes, it does. And then I can come in here and I can just say, this is my opinion. Go! All right, we've replaced everything. We have a viable thing. That is an introduction to the HTML helpers. Well, now that you've seen how the HTML helpers can remove the drudgery of building out forms and slinging data between controllers and view pages, let's take a look at what's different between MVC 1 and MVC 2. First thing I want to show you is if you hover over any of the HTML helpers here, any of these methods, you can see the return is no longer a string. It's an MVC HTML string, which on first glance looks a little strange. Why would you need to replace a string with a, well, glorified string object? The answer rests with HTML encoding. If you think about what's coming with ASP.NET, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but in ASP.NET 4, you're now going to have this syntax with a colon, which means HTML encode everything that is about to come. Now, currently, if you're using HTML 3.5, you have to use the HTML helper to do that. You say HTML.encode, which is kind of long and something that people don't necessarily know by default. There's been a big, strong movement from folks to have this, which is akin to response.write, to have that encode everything automatically. However, it was decided that it would not be backwards compatible, blah, 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 and so the team didn't do it. All right, so this still doesn't answer why we need to have this MVC HTML string. Well, the answer comes if you do something like that, which is perfectly valid if you're using .NET 4.0. However, we have a problem because all of the controllers by default will encode all of their HTML, including all their attributes. So if you encode encoded text, you kind of have double encoded stuff, which tends to be really, really ugly. So the MVC HTML string is fairly smart. It knows if it's been encoded, and if it's been encoded, it won't encode again. So that is why there is an MVC HTML string. Something to keep in mind. Okay, well for now, we just have to use this because we don't have any other way of doing it, and we can rely on the framework to encode the values coming out for our text box. Okay, so thing two, a lot of developers don't really care for what they call magic strings. And you remember I showed you that we could have typed this, or titled this, excuse me, as text title, txt title. It'll still work, but the framework all of a sudden will fall apart on us. It will just say, I don't know what you're talking about. I can't model bind this. So if we decide to use the magic of the framework and become magical about what we're doing, well, using convention, there it is. A lot of developers don't really like this. It's not exactly the easiest thing to understand, and it is, by definition, a magic string. So what the team has done is they've said, all right, fine, we've been trying to work out a way to do typed helpers, and we finally figured it out. And so what we can do here is just come in and ask for these, text box 4, and then you can pass in a value. Now, if you remember our field trip into the guts of the web form view page, now we looked at two things. We looked at the web form view page class and also the typed web form view page. And on that type, I pointed you at the model. I said, look at the model is typed, but in addition, look at the helper is typed as well. We're going to come back to that. No, we just did. That is why the helper is typed, so you can now work with the model explicitly. You can also do it for text areas and other things, but there is an issue with peppering it with default data like I've done right here. And at first, it might seem a little bit disconcerting. Oh no, I can't. If we take a look at this, text box 4, and I come in here and put published on, and then I say, what are the overloads here? Well, they removed a lot of them because they were really confusing. And unfortunately, one of them that they removed is setting the value. Well, you might think I can come in here and set the value in my HTML attributes. I can come in here and just say new, something like this, value, new value equals, datetime.now, etc. Turns out you can't do that because the value is set by the model binders. So it won't recognize that, unfortunately. So what do you do? Well, this comes down to actually, good design, for lack of better words. If you have a default value that you need to be put in here, it's actually property of the model itself. So the best place to do it is back in your home controller. And you come back in here, we'll go down to our create in here, and what I'm going to do, instead of putting the default value on the form, it's the concern of the model. So I'm going to say var post equals new post. And I'll say post.publishedOn equals datetime.now.to short date string. Great. Actually, I can't do that because that's a date. Datetime.now. Groovy. And then I'm going to pass this in as a part of the model. Good. So now we can terse things up a lot that way. All right, cool. You can also do text area 4. But what I wanted to show you here, there we go, text area 4, same thing. What I can do here, though, is I can actually terse this up a lot. And I want to show you a handy-dandy way, this is a tip from me to you, to get past all this, and it is to create an HTML helper of your very own. And so what I've done here is I have created an HTML helper class right here, Inside here, I have created a thing called Big Box, and it does all this stuff for me, including passing in this style. If you want to do this at home, it's just an extension method hanging off HTML helper. Make sure you reference system.web.mvc.html namespace. Well, now what I can do with Big Box is I don't have to type this all over again. So if I come back on the page here, I can just take this out, and I say Big Box, and then we'll just put the name back in. Now, of course, I don't need to be working with a string. If I wanted to, I could pass typed helper. I'm not going to do that for right now, but I could. But now this terses things up, and I can use Big Box all over the place. And I've dried it up incredibly. So those are the differences for the HTML helpers.